Today we're looking at 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. I was given this for Christmas by my girlfriend and I was slightly suspicious at the time that she was trying to tell me something. I then read it and then established that no, she definitely is trying to tell me several things. It opens with a somewhat pessimistic tone that life is far too short, but then it actually quite successfully takes you on a journey to establish that's kind of a good thing, as it should force us to focus better. It's a fairly basic book, and I guess probably not going to learn anything massive from it. But I actually read this during a week at work where things were particularly nuts. And I'm convinced the book helped, actually. I mean, given the time pressure and all the rest of it. So I think that establishes nicely that there is good value in going back to basics at some point, which this book does really well. It's a good book. I'm not knocking it at all, saying that it's fairly basic. And it's more philosophical musings on time than it is self-help strategies. I'm going to stick with my 3 quotes thing because I quite like that, and I am actually only going to do 3 this time. First up we have, the trouble with attempting to master your time is that your time ends up mastering you. That one feels disappointingly relevant to me. I have to say that's something I have to definitely work on. The next one is that consumerism misleads us into searching for meaning where none can be found. I quite like that. I find myself intrinsically sort of pushing back against this consumerist world, despite the fact of things behind that I've consumed. But you know, shallow consumerism and just new stuff and the next shiny thing. I quite like that. And then third one we have, do the next right thing. I like that one because it's so painfully simple and basic, and yet clearly covers such a profound idea and what is the next thing, obviously, and it ties back nicely to We Who Wrestle with God by Jordan Peterson that I did last time. And that idea that we do actually know what the next right thing is, and it's just you've got to aim at the right thing. There's the idea that I think everyone's come across that time is a resource. I don't think anyone would argue with that being the case now, and it seems sort of obviously true. But it hadn't occurred to me before that this wouldn't have been the case back in, for example, medieval times. When you put it like that, you can begin to see that, yeah, okay, there could be some problems with the sort of commoditisation of time. Not the least of which that I guess focus on the future will tend to wrench us out of the present, and that's definitely something I personally struggle with and need to work on. The idea that I found particularly useful last week whilst reading this during a horrible week was the concept that the best solution to the problem is just to accept that there isn't a solution, just sort of relax into the fact that you just can't do everything. And I suppose maybe abandon a YouTube project that's woefully unsuccessful. But then that does tie to an interesting idea that it's good sometimes to be unproductive, and then having an embarrassing hobby is proof that hobby is unproductive because you're not working towards some sort of end, because if you were, you'd be telling people about it and trying to do stuff. Maybe, something like that. Anyway, I'm enjoying doing this anyway. Of course, the necessary complication to that is whilst it's apparently good to be unproductive sometimes, by and large it would seem reasonable to expect that we should spend most of our time being productive. And that then ties to this idea of what boredom is, which is interesting. And the concept that all things that trigger boredom have one thing in common. That's basically that the way it puts it is that it makes us face up to our finitude. Basically the idea that we don't want to face up to the fact that we're finite, and that we will basically do anything to distract ourselves from this fact. In contrast then to the productive things we should be doing that trigger boredom because they make us face our finitude, distractions on the other hand feel sort of somewhat limitless. There's a horrible idea that we don't even need to enjoy them, they just have to feel like we're not bounded by them, which I guess is why in the day and age of smartphones they can't be a net good for the world, can they? And this book helps to explain why it is that feels like such a draw to people. Slightly disappointingly, I kind of thought this book was going to affirm my own theory that the people who tell you they're busy are the ones who aren't actually busy at all, or at least they're not busy doing the things they probably should be doing. I was convinced that was going to be in here, but it's not, so it's still my theory. I'm sticking to it though, it seems reasonable. Another thing it didn't help me with is whether it's okay to hate February. In my head, the world is divided into summer, which is basically March through to September, Christmas, which is October through to January, and then February. So it's neither Christmas nor summer, and it's just dark and cold, and it needs to buck its ideas up. And I don't really like February. I'm less attached to the idea these days, but earlier in my career, certainly, I might have been heard uttering such things as patience is a virtue of the idle. But it is apparently a good way to find some peace through surrender against the advancing time, although I can't quite work out if that means I should do anything different about February. One thing I am a fan of, though, that was in the book is JOMO, being joy of missing out, as opposed to its normal counterpart, FOMO, fear of missing out. I've never suffered with this because I quite like missing out on stuff. I'm quite happy that generally the thing I've chosen to do is what I wanted to do. But taking joy in missing out on things seems like a great way to set temporal boundaries or something like that. The book talks about this concept of temporal sovereignty, which is a wonderful thing, isn't it? I think that ties to a lot of the idea of being able to deliver a very pleasant no to an invitation to go and do something. It's really important. Because it's obviously true that if you have nothing to do, you don't really have a life. But equally true is if you have too much to do, then you're basically a passenger in life. So I do think it is very important to recognise that we don't always have to spend all of our time being a passenger and doing things that other people want of us. There's a very interesting time perspective thing he does in the book where he talks about people live to 100. It's not that common, but it does happen. I've met someone over 100. I know of a couple of others. And then he measures time in terms of being number of human life scales of 100 years. It's long, but it's valid, I think. And then you get things like the dinosaurs were wiped out 660,000 lifetimes ago. Okay, yeah, so what? It doesn't really help. But then you think something like the pyramids in Egypt were built 45 lifetimes ago. That's it. And then it gets even more extreme when you think 5 lifetimes ago, Henry VIII was sat on the throne. And I don't really have a point there at all, but I just thought that was a brilliant way to illustrate time. I thought it was really good. I mentioned earlier that presence is something I struggle with a little bit in the pursuit of trying to manage my time. And an interesting angle in the book on that is this sort of anti-view of hope, and the idea that hope is just this passive thing where you give in to whatever's happening in the present in the hope that whatever will be in the future will be better, and therefore abandoning hope is an affirmation on the future. It's a tricky idea, that I sort of like it, but without necessarily agreeing with it. It clearly needs some more thought. It also inevitably talks about a theory on how the passage of time feels like it's getting faster and faster as you get older, which I think we can all relate to. And it's an idea about how much your brain is processing and how, as you get older, more and more stuff is done on autopilot because you get into the habits and all the rest of it. So the antidote to that is supposedly to be doing lots of things where your brain is processing a lot. So lots of new experiences and learning things, that sort of thing. The trouble is, I guess that sort of relates to, if you sit on your bum and just watch telly, then your brain is processing all this new information. And theoretically, that should make time feel like it's going slower. But does it? I don't know if I sit down and watch enough telly to do that. But then I guess what's the point in having time feel like it's going slowly, but you're sat there on your bum not doing anything anyway. So, yeah, I guess it's an interesting idea anyway. Maybe the conclusion of that was actually in the book, but I did miss it. So, yeah, it's an open question. So if anyone has any ideas on that, I'd love to hear it. Finally, there's this great point that if you perceive from the right angles, life can look very different. So if you approach it with this mindset that time is precious and a minute spent is gone forever and you can never have it back, that perhaps urges people to do a bit more and spend their time more meaningfully, whatever that means for each of us. But that is a really difficult perspective to hold on to, isn't it? So you can get it in the minute and you go, yes, I've got it. And then you just go off, you stub your toe and you have to make dinner and do the washing or whatever, and it goes. I really enjoyed that anyway. Reasonably light-hearted with wisdom that should be obvious to all of us, but kind of isn't because it just gets lost in the everyday hustle. But yeah, well worth the read.